Amid the bright lights of New York, a powerful man faces the one battle his influence cannot win, the pain of loss. David Miller, a respected businessman, seems to have everything others dream of, but inside his luxurious penthouse reigns the cruelest silence. Since the tragic accident that took his wife, his 6-year-old daughter Emily has sunk into a colorless world where words have vanished and only tears speak for her. 13 caregivers have tried to fill the void, but none have managed to break through the wall the girl has built. Time keeps moving, and each day without progress weighs like an unbearable burden on David's shoulders. Until an unexpected young woman crosses his path, carrying invisible scars that allow her to see beyond pain. What once seemed like just another attempt will become the beginning of a transformation no one would dare to predict. Like, comment, and share, and watch the video until the end. This helps the channel grow and motivates us to keep creating stories that inspire. Tell us in the comments which city you're watching from. Subscribe to the channel and become part of our story. Emily's pain was an abyss that seemed to have no end. At first, everyone believed it was just a natural phase of grief, that in time the little girl would smile again, play again, and speak as she once did. But the months went by, and her silence became an unbearable weight inside the house. Emily would not respond when called, would not play with other children, and refused any gesture of affection that didn't come from her mother, now only a memory. The walls of her room were once covered with children's drawings, but now they were only reminders, traces of the past. The colored pencils lay forgotten in a box in the corner, while the girl curled up on the bed, clutching the teddy bear she had received on her last birthday with her mother. Her distant gaze and breasts broken by sobs were the portrait of a child's fragility, a child who had not yet learned to name the longing that consumed her. David tried to remain strong. Each morning he straightened his tie, came down for breakfast, and forced a smile for his daughter, but Emily would not even raise her eyes. He canceled meetings, postponed commitments, rearranged his entire schedule just to be near her. Yet he felt invisible to his own child. The household staff whispered in silence, moved but powerless before the sorrow that had taken over the home. At night, when the city lights reflected on the skyscrapers, the silence inside that penthouse seemed to scream. It was in those moments that David, alone, allowed himself to break down, hiding his face in his hands and asking how much strength he had left to go on. Emily's crying fits came without warning. A smell, a sound, even the wind through the window became triggers for memories she could not endure. She would call out for her mother, scream between sobs until exhaustion made her fall asleep in the arms of a caregiver, or sometimes on the very floor of her room. Nothing seemed to soothe her. Her favorite toys no longer held meaning, fairy tales lost their magic, and even walks through Central Park ended in tears. When other children tried to approach her, Emily would hide behind the caregiver's legs or beg to go home, refusing any contact that might remind her that her life would never be the same. David had already hired 13 different caregivers, some with impeccable resumes, others with experience dealing with traumatized children, but none managed to form a real bond. To Emily, they were all strangers. Some tried authority, demanding discipline, and were dismissed after making things worse. Others tried patience and understanding, but gave up in the face of her constant rejection. The result was always the same: more frustration, more pain, and a father sinking deeper into silent guilt. On sleepless nights, he asked himself if he had failed as a father, if he was incapable of filling the emptiness left by his wife. The weight of responsibility grew heavier each day, for this was not about business or reputation, but about the fragile heart of his only daughter. There were days when David believed Emily was improving. Small gestures, a longer glance, a whispered word, an unexpected hug rekindled his hope that things might change. But soon came the relapses, the midnight screams, the inconsolable crying. Each step forward seemed followed by 3 steps back, and the feeling of helplessness consumed both father and daughter. The doctors said the process would be slow, that the girl needed time and patience. But time felt like the cruelest enemy. While New York pulsed outside, life inside that home felt frozen, as if the clock's hands moved only to remind them of the absence that could never be replaced. Emily was just 6 years old, yet carried in her eyes a weight many adults could not bear. Her pain was not loud, not expressed in words, but present in every gesture, every silence, every vacant stare. For David, watching his daughter wither in life was worse than losing his wife. He knew he needed to find a way out, but every attempt failed, and each failure pushed him further into despair. The home once filled with laughter had become a place where the echo of silence and tears was the constant sound. And amid that devastation remained a single unanswered question. Who could bring back the light in that little girl's eyes? It was on a gray autumn morning that the door of that home, accustomed to the departures of caregivers, opened to welcome someone different. Grace Turner, a 27-year-old woman, entered without the imposing resumes of those who came before her, but with a serenity in her eyes that no diploma could provide. Her brown hair fell loosely over her shoulders, and the simplicity of her presence contrasted with the luxurious surroundings of the apartment. David observed her with suspicion, no longer expecting anything after so many failed attempts. Emily, curled up on the living room sofa, didn't even raise her head to see who had arrived. But Grace was not intimidated. In silence, she looked around as if acknowledging the grief inhabiting every corner of that home. And then she calmly approached, keeping enough distance not to frighten the girl. Grace was not just another caregiver. Her own story had shaped her to understand the pain of others. At 9 years old, she had lost her younger brother in a sudden accident. And since then, she had learned to live with a silence, much like Emily's. She knew what it was like for laughter to leave a home, to feel that the days no longer moved forward. That experience, though painful, had given her an uncommon sensitivity. Grace did not see Emily as merely a silent child. She saw in her a reflection of herself, of a childhood interrupted by grief. And that invisible connection made her believe that perhaps she could reach the girl's heart where so many others had failed. In their first encounter, Grace did not try to start conversations or offer toys. She simply sat on the floor of the living room, pulled a small sketchbook from her bag, and began to draw simple figures without saying a word. Emily at first remained still, clutching her teddy bear. But little by little, her curious eyes shifted toward the lines appearing on the paper. Grace drew a butterfly, then a flower, and then a small star. Each figure was a silent invitation. She did not look directly at Emily, but placed the sketchbook in a position where the girl could see it clearly. When she finished the drawing, she closed the notebook and set it on the coffee table, rising with a discreet smile. There was no pressure, no demands, only a simple gesture, heavy with meaning. David watched from a distance, intrigued. It was unusual to see someone act that way. All the other caregivers had tried, from the very first minute, to win Emily over with cheerful voices, colorful stories, or insistence. Grace, on the other hand, seemed to understand that pain needed space and time. There was something in her calm that inspired trust, something that spoke loudly even in silence. Deep inside, David felt a spark of hope, though he dared not show it. By the end of the day, Emily had not spoken a single word, but something different lingered in the air. When Grace said goodbye, the girl did not push her away as she had done with others. She simply followed her with her eyes until the door closed, as if taking note of the presence of this stranger who, somehow, did not feel like a threat. It was an almost imperceptible detail, but for David it meant a great deal. He couldn't explain it, but there was an energy in Grace that seemed to bring light to the space once suffocated by sorrow. That night, alone in his office, David thought long about the young caregiver. There was something special about her, something that went beyond techniques or professional experience. Grace carried with her a silent truth, a genuine empathy that could not be taught. For the first time in months, he wondered if this new presence could be the key to bringing a spark of life back into his daughter's eyes. Emily was still submerged in silence, but Grace had planted an invisible seed, a hope that had begun to sprout in the midst of despair. And it was only the beginning of a story that would forever change the lives of all three. In the second week since Grace's arrival, something unexpected happened within that home. Emily, until then locked inside her constant silence, seemed less hostile to the young caregiver's presence. Time passed in small gestures, drawings made side by side, short walks down the hallway, or simply the silent company of someone who demanded nothing of her. It was on a rainy afternoon, as drops slid down the living room window, that the first bond began to take shape. Emily was sitting on the rug, hugging her teddy bear, when Grace, in a low and gentle voice, began humming an old song. It was a simple melody, inherited from her childhood, one her own mother used to sing to comfort her children on difficult nights. At first, Emily remained motionless, as if ignoring the sound, but slowly her gaze lifted, fixing on the young woman in front of her. The music seemed to cut through the silence she lived in, reaching untouched places within her. David, watching from the half-open door, felt his heart race. For the first time in months, his daughter was reacting to something. Emily wasn't crying. She wasn't hiding. She was simply letting the melody wrap around her. When Grace finished, there were no applause, no words, but the simple gesture of the girl resting her head on the caregiver's arm was enough to show that something had changed. Grace did not break the moment. She kept humming, repeating the verses with the same calm, while gently running her hand over the girl's hair. Emily's breathing, once short and heavy, began to calm. The sobbing that always seemed ready to erupt gave way to a deep sigh, as if she were finally finding some kind of comfort. It was the first real sign of trust, a timid step, but a powerful one. That night, David could barely sleep. The images of that scene would not leave his mind. The businessman, so used to controlling every aspect of his life, now realized that his daughter's healing did not lie in expensive treatments or the most renowned caregivers, but in something far more human, the sensitivity of someone who understood pain from the inside. For the first time, he allowed himself to believe that he was not alone in this struggle. The days that followed brought small changes. Emily began to accept Grace's presence in activities she had previously rejected. She let her into her room, allowed her to sit nearby during meals, and on rare occasions, even reached out her hand to hold hers. Each gesture was silently celebrated by David, who watched everything with hope rekindled in his chest. Grace, however, acted as if it were natural, without haste, without forcing anything. She knew that every step toward the girl's heart had to be respected, like tending to a wound that still bled. The singing returned on other afternoons. Emily, more and more receptive, would even ask with her eyes for Grace to sing again. And so, through soft verses and notes filled with memory, the little girl found her first relief since her mother's loss. Music had become an invisible bridge between them, a safe place where grief needed no explanation in words. David, moved by the transformation, began to feel something new inside himself. It was not only gratitude, but the realization that Grace's presence was bringing warmth back into the home, a warmth he thought was lost forever. Seeing his daughter rest peacefully in someone else's arms made him realize that perhaps there was a way to rebuild life, even after tragedy. And so, in the silence filled with old melodies, the first bond was born, a fragile link, yet strong enough to break through months of darkness. In that instant, between soft notes and quiet sighs, hope began to bloom irreversibly. The transformation of the house began almost imperceptibly, but little by little, the signs became clear. The apartment of cold walls and silent hallways, once haunted by the echo of absence, was now filled with new sounds. Hurried footsteps of a child running, spontaneous laughter, gentle voices telling invented stories. Emily, once locked inside a cocoon of pain, began to open up, revealing fragments of a childhood interrupted by tragedy. Grace, with her infinite patience, was there for every step. The girl picked up her colored pencils again, scattering sheets across the floor and covering her walls once more with drawings. There were flowers, stars, even a picture of three people holding hands. When David saw those scribbles, tears welled in his eyes, not of grief, but of reborn hope. Mornings, once heavy, gained a new rhythm. Emily began coming down for breakfast with Grace, still shy but willing to sit at the table. The silence gave way to small words, sometimes whispered, sometimes almost inaudible, but enough to warm her father's heart. A simple good morning from his daughter carried the weight of a victory won through patience and love. David watched, moved at every step. He was no longer just a man trying to fulfill his role as a father between meetings and responsibilities, but someone learning to rediscover life through his daughter's eyes. Afternoons became the stage for new memories. Grace took Emily to Central Park, where, for the first time in months, The girl agreed to play on the swing. The wind tousled her hair as a timid smile spread across her face. David, watching from a distance, felt as if time had stopped. It was a simple gesture, but in that swing, pushed by Grace's steady hands, was proof that healing was possible. Other outings followed: improvised picnics, visits to children's bookstores, afternoons filled with hot chocolate, and stories read softly until sleep arrived. Each moment became another brick in the rebuilding of that family's life. What surprised David most was realizing that he too was changing. Before, home had seemed only a place of passage, a meeting point between professional commitments. Now the apartment was becoming a living space where laughter and simple conversations filled the emptiness. He began to allow himself to sit on the floor beside his daughter, to play with improvised puppets, to laugh at little things he once ignored. Grace was not only helping Emily reclaim her childhood, but teaching David to rediscover the fatherhood that grief had clouded. At night, the atmosphere of the home was no longer ruled by tears, but by a newfound serenity. Emily would fall asleep listening to Grace's soft songs, often holding her hand until she drifted into deep sleep. David would watch from the doorway, filled with gratitude and emotion too deep to describe. It was as if the home itself had begun to breathe again. The portraits of his wife, once unbearable reminders of pain, now slowly became sweet memories, woven into the new reality taking shape. Even the household staff, once tense in the heavy atmosphere, noticed the difference. The girls' laughter echoed through the hallways, and every gesture seemed to restore the energy that had been lost. Some days, Grace organized small group activities, encouraging Emily to bake cookies in the kitchen or paint alongside others. The home, once a stage of grief, was transforming into a refuge of affection and new beginnings. It was during this time that David realized something even deeper. Grace was not only helping his daughter, she was transforming them all. Her presence brought a lightness no luxury, no medical treatment, no external effort had ever provided. He was beginning to understand that true wealth was right there, in the simple gestures, the unexpected laughter, the spark returning to Emily's eyes. And while the city outside continued at its fast pace, inside that penthouse, a new chapter of life was being written, quietly with the colors of hope and the promise of a new beginning. The return of life to the Miller household did not go unnoticed by the society around them. In New York, where every gesture was observed and commented on, the transformation of David and his daughter quickly became the subject of conversation. Emily, once withdrawn and isolated, began attending school again. And though still shy, she no longer hid in the hallways. The girl's faint smile drew attention, but it was not just that which caught people's eyes. Beside her was often Grace, who had taken on not only the role of caregiver, but also that of constant companion. And it was precisely this closeness that began to fuel whispers and judgment. At social events where David inevitably had to appear, the comments became increasingly clear. Members of high society murmured over glasses of wine about the improper connection between a renowned businessman and his young daughter's caregiver. Some insinuated that David was using the fragility of the situation to justify a relationship outside accepted standards. Others claimed Grace was seeking personal gain by getting close to the family. What had once been mere speculation turned into open criticism disguised as concerned advice. David, who had always been a man of impeccable reputation, felt the weight of these voices. Yet he cared less about the looks directed at him than about the risk of Emily noticing the hostility. The little girl, still in the process of healing, could be deeply affected by the malice of adults. It was during a parent meeting at school that the tension became undeniable. Some mothers whispered just loudly enough to be heard, saying Grace was overstepping her role. Sitting on Grace's lap, Emily hunched her shoulders, realizing the comments were about them. Grace, calm and composed, simply embraced her, trying to shield her from that hostile environment. The days that followed were marked by growing pressure. Invitations to events began to dwindle, and longtime friends of David started to keep their distance, as if his choice to allow Grace into his family life were a social mistake. The media, always alert to influential names, even published discreet notes in social columns, insinuating that the businessman might be involved in a romance with someone far beneath his circle. David read those words with both indignation and concern. He knew the remarks didn't wound only him. They struck most deeply at his daughter and at the woman who had become essential to their lives. Grace, though affected, never showed weakness in front of the family. She continued her routine with Emily, taking her on outings, singing to her, helping with homework. But when she was alone, she could not escape the weight of it all. The memory of her own childhood, marked by pain, had taught her never to ignore the cruelty of the world. She knew that words, even whispered in secret, carried power to wound. She did not fear for herself, but for Emily. The girl was finally rediscovering the path to joy, and the last thing Grace wanted was to see that progress shattered by the judgment of others. David noticed the growing tension, and though he tried to reassure Grace, he admitted to himself that he had to face reality. New York society did not easily forgive those who broke its rigid standards. The image of a successful businessman becoming involved with a young caregiver did not fit the mold of perfection expected of him. For the critics, it didn't matter what pain he had endured, what healing he sought, or the happiness of his daughter. Only appearances mattered. The home that had regained its joy was now also a refuge from a world full of judgment. Emily, ever more attached to Grace, seemed to feel the need to protect her. In her drawings alongside stars and flowers, a new image began to appear. Three figures together, united. For the little girl, this was the portrait of the new family she longed for. For the outside world, however, it was a scandal. And so between the warmth of home and the coldness of social judgment, a conflict emerged that would test not only the bond between Grace and Emily, but also David's courage to fight for what truly mattered. The weeks that followed weighed heavily on Grace's heart. Despite all the progress Emily had made, the hostile glances and veiled comments of society began to erode the tranquility she tried to provide. Each time she walked the girl to school, she felt the whispers trailing behind her like invisible blades. Some mothers avoided greeting her, others turned their eyes away, and there were those who approached only to ask questions disguised as concern, but dripping with judgment. Grace kept her serene posture, but inside fear grew. She knew how sensitive Emily was and dreaded that the child would notice the cruelty surrounding them. David did everything he could to shield the two from that toxic environment. He ignored invitations to social gatherings, limited public appearances, and tried to project security in every gesture. But Grace could see how deeply he was also suffering under the pressure. The discreet notes in social columns, the insinuations about his personal life, the advice from close friends to be more cautious, all were wounds collecting in his silence. Though he appeared firm before her and his daughter, Grace knew David was torn between the image he had built over decades and the new reality blossoming inside his home. Emily, untouched by the complexities of the adult world, was only just beginning to bloom. Her laughter once again echoed through the halls, her little hands no longer trembled when holding crayons, and her nights were filled with lullabies instead of tears. For the girl, Grace had become a safe harbor, almost as essential as her father. But that very bond was what most frightened the young caregiver. If she stayed, she might expose Emily to ever harsher criticism. If she left, she knew it would cause pain, but perhaps less pain than facing an entire city ready to point fingers. It was on a silent night that Grace made her decision. Emily slept peacefully, hugging her teddy bear, and David worked in his office, buried in endless papers. Grace walked to the living room, sat on the couch, and gazed at the windows lit by the city. There, among skyscrapers and bustling streets, she felt small against the immensity of the world. She remembered her lost brother, the feeling of helplessness that had haunted her since childhood, and how that pain had shaped her to understand the suffering of others. But she also knew that the same world that had taught her about loss could be merciless to those who dared to defy its rules. The next morning, she asked David to talk. Her voice was steady, but her eyes carried deep sadness. She explained that she had made a difficult decision. She had to leave. She argued that her presence placed Emily at the center of cruel remarks, that the girl deserved to grow up in peace without being the target of adult malice. David tried to interrupt her, to convince her they could face everything together, but she remained resolute. With each word, her heart tightened, but she believed she was protecting the girl. When Emily realized what was happening, she ran into Grace's arms, crying as she hadn't in months. The embrace was long, silent, heavy with pain. Grace tried to smile, whispering that she would always be with her in thought, that she would never forget her. The girl with the innocence of childhood could not understand why someone who made her so happy had to leave. David, powerless, could only watch, feeling that the small flame of hope that had been rekindled in his home was beginning to fade. That day, the penthouse was once again filled with silence. Emily's laughter disappeared, and David sank back into loneliness. Grace had left, not because of a lack of love, but because she loved too much to risk hurting the girl. The decision she had made seemed the cruelest of all, to abandon the place where she had finally found meaning in order to protect the ones she most wanted to care for. And so, amid tears and emptiness, the Millers once again faced a loss, not as irreversible as the first, but just as devastating. The void left by Grace was palpable. The home that in recent months had become a refuge of laughter and small miracles closed itself once more in silence. Emily, confused and hurt, refused to speak and clung to her teddy bear as if it were the only tangible reminder of the one who had left. David, for his part, felt crushed. Every corner of the apartment, every hallway, seemed to echo with the absence of the young caregiver. He tried to resume the routine, taking his daughter to school, reading books to her, but nothing could fill the space Grace had left behind. The pain of loss was now different. It was not the grief of inevitability, but the absence of someone who had restored hope to their family's life. In the days that followed, David realized that Grace's departure had not only affected Emily. He himself felt the deep impact of her decision. He spent hours in his office, staring at documents without focus, his heart heavy and his thoughts consumed by the young woman who had so quietly and naturally transformed his daughter's life and his own, yet had left, creating an unbearable emptiness. Every gesture of Emily, every shy smile or distant stare, reminded him of how precious what they had lost truly was, and how Grace's absence was now a constant presence. At social gatherings, David began to feel the difference Grace's absence had created. The comments of society, once just background noise, now struck him more deeply, for he knew he had to protect his daughter alone. The critical stares consumed him. Parents at school, members of New York's elite, spoke subtly, or not so subtly, about the relationship he had with the caregiver, as if his private life were theirs to judge. David began to understand that to fully heal his daughter, he could no longer remain a passive observer. He had to act. Grace's absence became a force pushing David into deep reflection about his priorities. He realized he had tried for too long to live by others' expectations, following social conventions, maintaining an impeccable reputation, pleasing everyone around him. But all those rules had proved useless when it came to Emily's happiness and healing. The girl needed someone who would love her unconditionally, without caring about critical looks or malicious whispers. And David finally understood that Grace was not just a caregiver. She was an essential part of their rebuilding, part of the true family he longed to protect. The decision to act did not come without fear. David knew that publicly confronting his critics meant breaking social barriers and exposing himself to the judgment of New York's elite. But for the first time since his wife's death, he felt an absolute clarity about what mattered most: his daughter's happiness and the woman who had restored hope to them both. He began to form a plan. First, he had to bring Emily back from the isolation Grace's departure had imposed. Then, he had to show the world he would not be intimidated by malicious words or rigid conventions. That afternoon, when he returned home, he found Emily sitting on her bedroom floor, clutching her teddy bear tightly. The little girl lifted her eyes and David approached slowly, kneeling before her. With a firm yet gentle voice, he reminded her that Grace loved her and that nothing could change that bond. He explained that even from afar, the caregiver remained in her heart, but that he would do everything in his power to bring her back. Emily looked at him with cautious hope, and in that instant, David knew he had to act decisively. In the days that followed, he faced the first signs of public judgment with renewed courage. At meetings and social gatherings, he responded firmly to cruel remarks, affirming that his daughter's happiness was his absolute priority and that Grace was part of their family. Every word carried determination. Every gesture conveyed unconditional love. David finally realized that the greatest battle of his life was not against the world, but for those he loved. And by declaring his position without fear, he made it clear that he was ready to face any obstacle to rebuild his family, bringing Grace back and restoring the joy that seemed lost. The reunion came on a bright afternoon when sunlight poured through the apartment windows, illuminating every corner that had been silent for weeks. Emily was sitting on the living room rug, surrounded by toys that were returning to her routine, yet she still gazed at the door with a mix of expectation and apprehension. Seeing the spark of hope in his daughter's eyes, David felt his heart race. He had made his decision. He would not allow anyone or anything to stand in the way of his family's happiness. Every step that led him to the phone and then to Grace's door had been guided by the conviction that true love had to be protected, and that the woman who had transformed their lives could not be left behind. When Grace opened the door, the world seemed to pause. Her eyes met David's first, filled with determination and tenderness, and then turned to Emily, who froze for a few seconds, unable to believe that the presence she had longed for was real again. The little girl ran without hesitation, throwing herself into Grace's arms. The embrace was long and silent, yet overflowing with emotions no words could capture. Tears ran down all three faces, blending relief, joy, and the sense that they had finally returned to where they belonged. David approached slowly, feeling the weight of every lost second and the lightness of the present moment. Kneeling before his daughter, he held her hand, while Grace, still holding Emily, allowed herself to breathe in relief. For the first time since joining the family, she felt the struggle no longer had to be fought alone. The bond she had built with the girl, fragile yet precious, was back, stronger than ever. With a trembling voice, David thanked Grace, not only for caring for his daughter, but for helping him rediscover the meaning of love and hope. The following days were filled with a joy that felt almost unreal. Emily once again ran through the house, hummed songs, and laughed at small jokes. Grace was there for every moment, without rush, without pressure, offering only the security and affection the child needed. Watching them, David felt a deep, almost overwhelming happiness. The realization that life, even after so much loss, could be rebuilt with tenderness and devotion. The atmosphere of the home changed once more. The once silent halls echoed with laughter. The smell of fresh cookies filled the air, and every object seemed to carry renewed meaning. Grace's presence also transformed David himself. He allowed himself moments of lightness, joined in his daughter's games, laughed at her small mischiefs, and cherished every simple instant once forgotten in the rush of work. The bond between the three grew stronger with every gesture, every glance, every word shared. Emily, once so withdrawn and wounded, now embraced life with trust and joy, her smile reflecting the quiet transformation of everyone around her. One evening, as the sun set and painted the sky in shades of orange and gold, David knew the time had come. With a determined look, he held Grace's hand and declared, with quiet emotion, that he would no longer allow external pressure or judgment to interfere with their happiness. He explained that she was an essential part of the family, that her love and dedication could not be ignored, and that the rebuilding they had begun together had to be lived fully. Grace, moved, answered with a smile that blended joy and relief, recognizing that she had finally found someone willing to fight for what truly mattered. Emily, sensing the tenderness and seriousness of the moment, hugged them both at once, completing the circle of affection and safety that had been restored. In that instant, the painful past felt distant, replaced by the promise of joyful days, by the certainty that family, though scarred by life, could remain united and strong. That moment was not just a physical reunion, but an emotional restoration, a declaration of courage and love that transformed every wound into wisdom, every tear into strength, and every absence into the treasure of presence. Life, at last, felt whole again. The home of David and Emily had returned to being a place of laughter, tenderness, and shared memories. Grace was no longer just a caregiver. She was part of the family, an indispensable presence for their happiness. And in that home, bathed in the golden light of late afternoon, the promise of brighter days was fulfilled, proving that true love, when protected and nurtured, had the power to heal even the deepest wounds and transform life forever. And so ends another emotional chapter here on Enchanting Stories, where every story touches the heart and inspires new beginnings. If you smiled, felt moved, or even shed a tear with the journey of David, Emily, and Grace, you already know your place is here with us. Click subscribe and become part of our growing community, full of people who believe in the power of true connections. Don't forget to leave a like, because every like is a warm hug, sending positive energy to all of us. Tell us in the comments which city you're watching from. We want to feel close to you, even from afar. And stay tuned, because every day brings a new story capable of warming your heart. Come laugh, dream, and feel with us.